The gunshot echo had not yet faded from the hills above Larkspur when Elijah Reed came off his horse at a dead run down Main Street, one arm hanging useless and dark with blood, the other clutched white-knuckled around the saddle horn, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright in this world. "The Wells!" he shouted, though his voice cracked and broke apart before he could finish. "It ain't the Doyles, it's—" And then his knees buckled and he went down hard into the dust in front of the mercantile, and the horse, lathered and wild-eyed, screamed and reared and bolted off toward the livery without him. Lillian Aldridge was already moving before most folks on the street had finished turning their heads. She had been crossing from the schoolhouse where she'd been lancing a boil on the schoolteacher's thumb, her doctor's bag still swinging from her hand, and she reached the fallen stranger while half of Larkspur was still deciding whether to be afraid or curious. "Someone fetch water and clean linen," she said, already kneeling in the street dirt, her fingers finding the pulse at his throat, fast and thready but there. "And somebody find Sheriff Barlow. Now, not after you've finished gawking." The man's shirt was soaked through on the left side, the wound high in his shoulder but too close to the collarbone for her liking, and there was a second wound low on his ribs that worried her more. His face was gray beneath a week of trail dust and sunburn, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and blood, and his eyes, when they fluttered open for one terrible moment, were the color of creek water in shadow, and they found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch even as her hands kept working. "Ma'am," he managed, "you have to listen. They're coming, right behind me. Don't let them." And then his eyes rolled back and he went limp against her arm, and whatever warning he had ridden so hard and bled so much to deliver died half-spoken in the dust of a street baking under a sun that had not shown mercy to Larkspur, Wyoming territory, in 6 weeks. It was the second week of July, 1878, and the whole Sweetgrass Valley was dying of thirst. The creek that gave the town its name had shrunk to a brown trickle. The Larkspur town well, the only one deep enough to hold water through a summer like this one, had been rationed for 11 days. Cattle bawled from dry pastures on both sides of the valley, and men who had been neighbors for 15 years had taken to eyeing each other's stock with suspicion sharp enough to cut. Lillian did not know any of that yet mattered to the man bleeding out in front of her. She only knew he was dying, and she was, for the moment, the only thing standing between him and the ground taking him for good. "Someone help me get him inside," she said, and it was not a request. It took 4 men to carry Elijah Reed into the small frame house at the end of Main Street that served as both Lillian's home and her surgery, and by the time they had him laid on the table she used for such purposes, she had already cut away his shirt and was pressing a folded cloth hard against the wound in his ribs. "Bullet's still in him," she said to no one in particular, though Sheriff Tom Barlow had arrived by then, hat in hand, standing in her doorway with the look of a man who had seen trouble coming for weeks and was only now watching it walk in on its own legs. "2 wounds. Shoulder's a clean pass-through, I think, but the rib wound is deeper and I don't like the color of the blood. Tom, I need you to keep everyone out of my house who isn't carrying water or clean cloth. Lillian, he said something about the Wells before he went down, about the Doyles." "He said it wasn't the Doyles," she corrected, not looking up from her work. "Whatever he meant by it, it can wait until he's alive to explain it properly. Go, please." Barlow went. He was a good man, the sheriff, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and Lillian had watched over the past year as the weight of a valley, coming slowly apart at the seams, had bent his shoulders lower each season. She did not have time to think about that now. She had a man's life in her hands and precious little of the 2 things she needed most: clean water, in a town where every barrel was accounted for, and time, which no one had ever managed to rescue for her before it ran out. She worked through the worst heat of the afternoon with the windows open and no breath of wind coming through them, sweat running into her eyes as she probed for the bullet lodged against a rib that had, mercifully, turned it rather than let it find a lung. She talked to him as she worked, the way she always did with patients too far gone to hear her, because it steadied her hands to hear her own voice steady. "You have got to stop losing blood, whoever you are," she murmured, working the forceps with the delicate patience of a woman who had done this more times than she cared to count, in more towns than she cared to remember, because that was the shape her life had taken since she left Ohio 6 years ago. A doctor who went where doctors did not stay, because the frontier did not reward permanence, not for a woman who insisted on practicing medicine instead of embroidery. "You rode a long way to warn somebody about something. Seems a shame to die before you get to finish the sentence." The bullet came free a little after 4 in the afternoon, misshapen and ugly, and she dropped it into a tin cup with a sound that made her exhale for what felt like the first time in an hour. She packed the wound, stitched what could be stitched, and by the time the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western ridge, Elijah Reed was breathing steadier, if not yet safely, and Lillian Aldridge had used nearly a full barrel of the town's rationed water boiling instruments and washing wounds, and she did not regret one drop of it. She was still sitting beside him near midnight, watching the rise and fall of his chest by lamplight, when Tom Barlow knocked soft at her door. "2 men rode in about an hour past," he said, keeping his voice low though the patient on the table was in no state to overhear anything. "Say they're investigators for the Continental Range and Cattle Company, out of Cheyenne, looking into cattle theft, asking after a man matching this one's description. Said he stole from the company and they mean to see him answer for it." Lillian felt something cold move through her despite the heat still radiating off the walls. "Did you tell them he was here?" "I told them a lot of men passed through Larkspur, and I couldn't say who was where. But Lillian, one of them, a man named Cole, he had a way of looking at me like he already knew the answer and was just seeing whether I'd lie to him." Barlow rubbed a hand over his jaw. "I don't like it. I don't like any part of this." "Then don't tell them anything more," Lillian said. "He is my patient. Until he tells me otherwise, that is the only thing anyone in this town needs to know." Barlow looked at her for a long moment, the lamplight carving deep lines into a face that had not looked young in years. "You be careful, doctor. Whatever this fellow rode through to get here, it's not finished chasing him." He was more right than either of them yet understood. Lillian did not sleep that night, nor much of the next 2. The fever came for Elijah Reed the way it always came for wounds packed with trail dust and days of hard riding before they were ever properly cleaned. A slow creeping heat that turned his skin dry and his breathing shallow, and she fought it with the only tools a heat-starved town could spare her. Willow bark tea, cool cloths from water she rationed as carefully as if it were gold, and a stubbornness that had carried her through worse odds in worse places. On the second night he thrashed and called out names she did not recognize, a woman's name once, softly, that made her pause with the cloth halfway to his forehead and wonder, in a moment she was too tired to be ashamed of, who was waiting somewhere for this stranger to come home. On the 3rd day the fever broke. She did not know it yet, because she had finally, mercifully, fallen asleep in the chair beside him sometime after dawn, her head tipped back and her hands still loosely folded around a cloth gone cold in her lap. When she woke, disoriented and stiff, the sun was high and hot through the window, and the first thing she registered blearily was that the ache in her own body was worse than she remembered, and the second thing was that Elijah Reed's eyes were open and fixed on her, clear and aware for the first time since he had fallen in the street. "You have been talking to me for 3 days," he said, his voice a dry rasp but steady. "I do not think you know how much of it I heard." Lillian sat up fast enough to make her head spin. "You are awake. Seems that way." A ghost of something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though his eyes were watchful, assessing her the way a man assessed strange territory. "You are the one who dug the bullet out of me. I am the one who kept you from dying in my street, yes." She reached automatically for his wrist, counted his pulse, found it steadier than it had any right to be. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot twice and then argued with about it for 3 days." He tried to shift and winced, sharp and honest, and she pressed a hand flat against his good shoulder to still him. You will feel considerably worse if you move around before that wound has a chance to close properly. Lie still, mister, she stopped, realizing she had never learned his name, only tended his body while his mind was elsewhere, in fevered country she had not been able to follow him into. Reed, he said. Elijah Reed. Dr. Lillian Aldridge. She said it simply, without the apology some men expected to hear in a woman's introduction of her own profession, and watched him take it in without so much as a blink of surprise, which she noted, despite herself, in his favor. You rode into town 3 days ago half dead, and said something about the wells not being the Doyles' doing. Sheriff Barlow would very much like to know what you meant, and so, I confess, would I, though it can wait until you've had broth and rested another day. Something shifted behind his eyes, urgency cutting through the haze of pain. How long did you say? 3 days. 3 days, yes. He tried to sit up again, and this time she let him, because the look on his face was not confusion but dread, and she had learned to trust that particular expression on the faces of men who had ridden hard for a reason. Dr. Aldridge, I need you to tell me what has happened in this town while I was down, every bit of it, because if it is what I fear, we are already behind. She should have made him wait. She should have insisted on broth and rest, and the slow patience good medicine demanded. But there was something in his voice, low and controlled even through obvious pain, that told her patience was a luxury they might not have, and so instead she pulled her chair closer to the table where he lay and said, "Tell me what you fear, Mr. Reed, and I will tell you what I know." What Lillian knew, gathered in fragments from Tom Barlow's visits over the past 3 days while she'd been too consumed with keeping a stranger alive to fully absorb its weight, was this. 2 men who called themselves company investigators, Cole, and a second man named Hendricks, had not left Larkspur after their first night. They had instead taken rooms above the saloon, and within 2 days had somehow convinced the town council, in an emergency meeting Lillian had been too occupied to attend, that the Continental Range and Cattle Company held a lien against the towns, well on account of a debt incurred 4 years earlier when the town borrowed company money to drill it deeper during the last dry summer. The company was, Cole informed the council with the mild reasonableness of a man delivering unwelcome but unavoidable news, well within its rights to oversee the water's distribution until certain irregularities involving cattle theft and a fugitive named Elijah Reed were resolved. Which meant that when Lillian finally stepped outside her own front door on the morning of the 4th day, blinking in sunlight so bright it hurt, to fetch water for her patient's broth, she found a man she did not recognize standing at the town well with a rifle across his knees and a tin cup collecting a fee, in coin, for every bucket drawn. She stood on her own porch for a long moment simply staring, because 3 days ago that well had belonged to the town, to every family who had helped dig it, and now a stranger sat beside it like a toll keeper on a bridge that had appeared overnight. Dr. Aldridge. Tom Barlow's voice, tired and apologetic, came from behind her. He had crossed the street to meet her, hat already off. I tried to stop it. The council, they're scared, Lillian. Corbett, the man they answer to in Cheyenne, he sent word that the loan comes due whether we like the terms or not, and with the feud between the Doyles and the Wellers already boiling, nobody had the stomach to fight 2 battles at once. What feud? Lillian asked, though even as she said it she felt the pieces of the last several days rearranging themselves into a shape she did not like. Weller cattle went missing off the north pasture 2 nights back, found tracks leading toward Doyle land. Patrick Doyle swears his boys never touched them, but Hiram Weller's about ready to ride over there with every gun on his ranch and half the valleys taking sides. Barlow's jaw worked. It has been building for a month, Lillian. Ever since that Corbett fellow started sending men through, real friendly, offering top dollar for either ranch, first one to sell gets the good price, he says. Both men refused. Now this. Lillian thought of Elijah Reed lying in her surgery, insisting through cracked lips that it was not the Doyles, and felt the last of her fatigue burn away in something sharper and colder. "I need to speak with him again," she said. "Now." She found him already trying, with grim and clumsy determination, to sit upright on the table, sweat standing out on his brow from the effort. "Lie back down before you tear your stitches," she snapped, more sharply than she intended, and he obeyed, which surprised her almost as much as the pain plainly written across his face. "Tell me what has happened," he said. She told him. The well, the toll, the missing Weller cattle and the tracks toward Doyle land, the fear sitting like a fever over the whole town. He listened with his jaw tight, and when she finished, he closed his eyes for a moment as though absorbing a blow he had known was coming and had simply hoped to arrive before. "His name is Silas Corbett," Elijah said. "He works for the Continental Range and Cattle Company, out of a Chicago investment concern that has never set foot in this territory and never intends to, so long as the money keeps arriving. I rode for the Weller Ranch 2 months back, hired on as a line rider. About 3 weeks ago, I found one of Corbett's men, Hendricks, salting the upper spring on Weller land with something that made the cattle sicken. Not 2 nights later, I found cattle driven off Weller pasture with tracks doctored to lead toward the Doyle fence line. It is not a feud, Dr. Aldridge. It is a business plan. Corbett wants both ranches broke and desperate to sell before the railroad survey comes through this valley next spring, because whoever holds that land when the rail line is set will own the only water rights worth having between here and the Wind River." Lillian sat very still, turning this over. "You have proof of this?" "I had proof. Ledger pages I took off Hendrick's saddlebag when he wasn't looking, showing payments to men for work that was never honest ranch labor. I gave them to a man named Jonas Pratt, Corbett's own bookkeeper, who'd started to sicken at what he was being asked to write down and cover up. He was going to carry them to the circuit court himself when Marshal Ashford comes through in September for the fall session. But Hendricks and another man caught wind of it, caught me instead, on the ridge road 2 days out from here. I was shot getting away. Pratt, far as I know, ran for it toward the high country, toward an old trapper's line shack up near Miller's Pass. I do not know if he made it, and if he did not." Elijah met her eyes, and there was something in his face, exhaustion and grief, and a kind of dogged refusal to be beaten that she recognized, because she had worn the same expression herself more times than she could count in 6 years of frontier medicine. Then 2 families lose everything they've built, and a man dies for trying to do the right thing, and Silas Corbett buys this whole valley for the price of a bad summer. Lillian sat with that for a long moment, the heat pressing close through the open window, the sound of the toll keeper's coins clinking faintly from the well 2 streets over. "Marshal Ashford is not due until September," she said slowly. "That is nearly 2 months. Corbett clearly does not intend to wait that long to force a sale." "What is his timeline?" "There's a note due on the Weller Ranch," Elijah said. "Corbett's bank holds it, through some arrangement Hiram Weller didn't understand until it was signed. 10 days, Dr. Aldridge. If Weller can't pay, and with his herd already suffering he won't be able to, the ranch goes to auction, and Corbett's company will be the only bidder with cash in hand." 10 days, she repeated. "And if the Doyles and the Wellers come to open blood before then, over cattle Corbett's men stole and planted themselves, it will not matter whether anyone can pay the note. There will not be a ranch left standing worth fighting over." Outside, a dog barked, and somewhere down Main Street, a woman's voice was raised in an argument Lillian could not make out the words of, only the tone, brittle and afraid. She thought of the well with its armed toll-keeper. She thought of the town council, too frightened to refuse a lien 4 years old, and conveniently remembered only now. She thought of a whole valley of neighbors who had helped each other through blizzards and droughts for a generation, being turned by a stranger's money into enemies. "Then we do not have 2 months, she said. "We have 10 days, and we need Jonas Pratt and whatever proof he is carrying, alive and in front of someone with the authority to make Silas Corbett answer for what he has done." Elijah studied her for a long moment. "You believe me, just like that?" "I believed you 3 days ago in the street, bleeding and half out of your mind, when you tried to warn a town full of strangers instead of saving your own breath to keep breathing. Lillian stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that were, she noted with some private surprise, not entirely steady. I do not intend to stop believing you now simply because it is inconvenient. A faint, tired smile crossed his face. Most folks would call it more than inconvenient. Most folks would call it dangerous. Most folks, Lillian said, are not the ones who spent 3 days keeping you alive, Mr. Reed. I did not do that so Silas Corbett could finish what his hired gun started. She meant it as simple resolve, but something in the way he looked at her afterward, quiet and searching, told her he had heard more in it than she intended, and she found, to her own mild alarm, that she did not entirely mind. He was not fit to ride for another 4 days, whatever his own stubbornness argued, and Lillian spent those days rebuilding his strength with broth and rest, even as she watched Larkspur's temperature rise degree by degree, in ways that had nothing to do with the merciless sun. She saw the toll-keeper's rifle grow more visible each day. She heard, second-hand through Tom Barlow, that Patrick Doyle had ridden to the Weller ranch demanding an accounting and been met at the gate by armed men, and that only Hiram Weller's own daughter, a sharp-tongued young woman named Mary Weller, had kept the confrontation from becoming a shooting match by physically standing between the two furious men and refusing to move. On the 5th day, with Elijah able to sit a chair without gray creeping into his face, Lillian made her decision. I am coming with you, she said, when you go after Pratt. Elijah, who had been testing the strength of his shoulder with slow, careful movements, went still. Dr. Aldridge, that is not a ride for. Do not, she said quite calmly, finish that sentence with the word you are about to use. He closed his mouth, considered her for a moment, and to his credit, did not try again with different words that meant the same thing. It is a hard ride into rough country, and if Pratt is alive up there, he will need more than a friendly face. He will likely need exactly what you know how to give him. I was going to say that is not a ride I want to ask of anyone I am responsible for putting in danger. You are not asking. I am telling you I intend to go, because if that man is alive, he is very likely wounded, exposed, or ill, given how long it has been, and I am the only doctor in 3 days' ride in any direction. You need me for this to succeed, Mr. Reed, whether you are comfortable with that or not. He studied her, and something in his face shifted from reluctance into something more like respect settling into place. You do not scare easy, do you? I scare plenty, Lillian said. I simply do not let it decide things for me. Now, if we are riding in 5 days, you will eat everything I put in front of you and stop arguing about broth. That surprised a real laugh out of him, low and rusty from disuse. Yes, ma'am. It was, she would think much later, the first moment she had felt something other than clinical urgency where Elijah Reed was concerned, and she filed it away carefully, the way she filed away any observation she was not yet ready to examine too closely. They left Larkspur before dawn on the 10th day, 6 days before the note on the Weller ranch was due, with 2 horses, a week's provisions, Lillian's doctor's bag reinforced with extra quinine and bandages, and a story for anyone who asked, that Dr. Aldridge was riding out to the Weller ranch to tend a sick relative, which was true enough in spirit if not in fact. Tom Barlow watched them go from the edge of town, his face carved with worry he did not bother hiding, and pressed a folded paper into Lillian's hand at the last moment. If you find Marshal Ashford's circuit rider anywhere along the way, or any deputy of the territory, you show them this. It is everything I can attest to about the well and the council meeting, signed and dated. It is not much, but it is something. It is more than nothing, Tom. Thank you. They rode north and west, away from Larkspur and toward the high shoulders of the mountains that fed the Sweetgrass Valley its water, when there was water to be had at all. For the first hours neither of them spoke much. The silence filled instead with the creak of saddle leather and the dry rasp of grasshoppers rising in clouds from grass gone brittle and gold with drought. Lillian watched Elijah's seat in the saddle, alert for any sign the ride was costing him more than he would admit, and found instead a man settling into the rhythm of horseback the way some men settled into an armchair. At ease in a way, he had not been lying flat on her table. "You ride well for a man 3 days off death's door," she observed. "I have been riding since before I could walk properly. My father broke horses for the army out of Fort Riley when I was young." A shadow crossed his face. "Before that went bad, too." "Went bad how?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then, "Land speculators back in Kansas in '69. Different company, same shape of scheme. They wanted the creek bottom my father had homesteaded, said the survey lines were wrong, tied us up in court for 2 years until we could not afford the lawyers anymore. We lost it. My father never did recover his spirit after that, not really. Died 5 years later, still angry, still poor." Elijah's hands were steady on the reins, but his voice had gone flat in the particular way of old grief worn smooth by handling. "So when I started noticing what Corbett's men were doing to the Wellers, I suppose I recognized the shape of it faster than most would have." "I am sorry," Lillian said, and meant it, and did not try to fill the silence after with anything else, because she had learned in 6 years of frontier doctoring that some grief only wanted acknowledgement, not solutions. "What about you?" Elijah said after a while, glancing sideways at her. "A doctor riding this territory alone before I ever turned up bleeding in your street. What is your shape of it?" Lillian considered how much to tell him, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to tell him more than she usually offered strangers. "I trained in Cleveland, one of only 3 women in my class, and the only one who finished. I was engaged briefly to a man who admired the idea of a lady doctor considerably more than he admired the reality of one who kept odd hours and came home smelling of carbolic acid and other people's suffering. When he asked me to give up my practice after we married, I gave him back his ring instead. Just like that. Not just like that. It cost me a great deal to do it. But I did not train for 6 years to spend my life mixing tonics for other women's headaches, while a man decided which patients I was permitted to see." She heard the edge in her own voice and did not soften it. "So I came west, where towns are desperate enough for any doctor that they will overlook the inconvenient fact that mine is not the sort of body most people expect to see carrying a surgeon's bag. I have not stayed anywhere longer than 18 months since." "Why not?" "Because towns that need a doctor badly enough to take a woman often decide, once the crisis passes, that they would prefer to wait for a man after all." She said it without bitterness, only weary honesty. "Larkspur has been better than most. I have been there a year already. I had begun to think I might stay longer than usual." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I would count that in the town's favor, not yours needing to lower any standard." Something in her chest loosened at that, small and unexpected, and she found herself glancing at him with new attention, the line of his jaw, the careful, watchful kindness in eyes the color of creek water in shadow, and thought that perhaps this ride would teach her a great deal more than the location of one hidden bookkeeper. They made camp that first night in a dry wash sheltered by cottonwoods, and it was there, over a small fire built more for the coffee than for warmth in air that had not cooled below uncomfortable even after sundown, that they had their first real argument, though it did not feel like the sort that ended things. It felt oddly like the sort that built something. "When we find Pratt," Elijah said, "if he is fit to travel, I say we bring him straight down to Cheyenne ourselves, to the Territorial Land Office. Corbett has friends in Larkspur's council now. I do not trust the note or the ledger to survive there. Cheyenne is 4 days' hard ride from Miller's Pass, in the wrong direction from Larkspur," Lillian said. "The Weller note comes due in 5. If we are not back before then, Hiram Weller loses the ranch regardless of what proof we carry, and once that auction happens, no ledger in the world unsigns the deed. Then we ride through the night if we have to. You were shot twice 12 days ago, Elijah. I did not stitch you back together so you could tear yourself apart proving a point." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice it, something flickering behind his eyes before he set his jaw stubbornly. "I have ridden through worse. I am certain you have. That does not mean you should when there is a wiser course available." She kept her voice level but firm. "Sheriff Barlow is an honest man, frightened but honest, and he has the standing in Larkspur to hold a hearing the moment Marshal Ashford's circuit brings him near enough, which by my understanding of the usual route should be within 3 weeks, not 2 months, if we send word ahead. We do not need Cheyenne. We need Pratt alive, the ledger intact, and enough time to get both in front of the marshal before Corbett can bury the evidence or bury the man. And if Barlow folds the moment Corbett's men lean on him again, you have seen what they have already done to that town in 10 days. Then I will stand in that hearing myself and testify to everything you told me and everything I have seen, and I will not be quiet about it, and neither, I think, will you. The law is slow, Elijah, and it does not always arrive in time to prevent every wound. But it endures when men with money think they can simply outlast it. I have seen it work, even out here, even against men who thought their pockets made them untouchable. I would rather trust that than ride into a strange city with no allegiance to us at all, gambling everything on strangers who owe us nothing." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the small fire, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its edge. "You believe that, truly believe it." "I have to," Lillian said simply. "I have watched too many men decide the law was too slow and take justice into their own hands, and I have sewn up what was left of them afterward far more often than I have celebrated a clean victory. I am not naive about how often the law fails, Elijah. I have simply decided that giving up on it entirely costs more than the failures do." He studied her across the fire, and something in his expression eased, the stubbornness giving way to something more thoughtful. "My father used to say something similar before Kansas broke him of it. I suppose I stopped believing it could still be true out here." A pause. "I am not saying you are wrong. I am saying it is going to be a hard thing to trust after what I have seen." "Then trust me instead of the law for now," Lillian said, surprising herself with the boldness of it. "I am not asking you to have faith in strangers, Elijah. I am asking you to have faith in what we do together over these next days. That much, at least, I think you can manage." He looked at her for a long moment, firelight catching the planes of his face, and something passed between them that neither one named aloud, but both, she thought, felt settle into place all the same. "All right, Dr. Aldridge," he said finally, quiet and warm. "We do it your way, for now." They reached the Weller Ranch on the afternoon of the second day, dust-caked and saddle-sore, to find the place bristling with tension so thick it seemed to hang in the heat-shimmered air. Hiram Weller, a broad, gray-bearded man with a face like weathered granite, met them at the gate with a shotgun that did not lower even after Elijah called out his own name. "Reed. Heard you'd been shot on my account and never came back to say whether you lived or died." "I am here now, Hiram, and I have brought proof of everything I told you, once we get to it." Elijah's voice was steady despite the shotgun. "This is Dr. Lillian Aldridge out of Larkspur. She has been keeping me breathing this past fortnight. We need your help, and not much time to explain why." It was Mary Weller, Hiram's daughter, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, who finally lowered her father's shotgun barrel with one impatient hand and said, "For heaven's sake, Papa, the man is white as flour and the woman beside him carries a surgeon's bag. Let them inside before you shoot somebody we actually need." Over strong coffee in the ranch house kitchen, with the shutters drawn against the worst of the afternoon heat, Elijah laid out everything: the salted spring, the doctored cattle tracks, Corbett's scheme, Jonah's Pratt fleeing toward Miller's Pass with the only proof that might save 2 ranches and a town. Hiram Weller's granite face did not soften exactly, but something in it shifted, old suspicion giving way to a grim, tired understanding. "I always thought it strange," he said finally, "that Doyle cattle disappeared same week mine did, tracks leading both directions like a signpost meant to be found. Never did make sense a man raised beside me 20 years would suddenly turn thief. He rubbed a hand over his beard. What do you need from me? Fresh horses, if you can spare them, supplies for the high country, and word sent quietly to Patrick Doyle, if you are willing, telling him what we have told you, before either of your families does something that cannot be undone. Weller's jaw tightened, old pride warring with what Lillian could see was genuine, weary relief at being offered another explanation besides betrayal. Mary can ride to the Doyle place. She has more patience for that stubborn old fool than I do these days. Mary Weller, arms crossed, gave Lillian a long, assessing look. You are really a doctor out here. I am. Good, Mary said, with the brisk approval of a woman who had clearly had her fill of being told what women could or could not manage. Then you will not faint when I tell you Miller's Pass has an old trapper's shack about 6 miles past the tree line, on the north face, hard to find unless you know the deer trail behind it. My brother and I used to hunt up there before he went to Montana. I can draw you a map good enough to follow. By the time they left the Weller ranch the next morning, they had fresh horses, 3 days of supplies, a rough map marked in Mary Weller's confident hand, and something Lillian had not expected to gain from the visit. The beginning of a fragile bridge between two families who had, until 2 days ago, been readying themselves to spill blood over cattle neither of them had actually stolen from the other. You did that, Elijah said, as they rode away from the ranch and the sun climbed higher over hills gone the color of old bone. Weller was ready to shoot first and ask nothing later. You talked him into listening instead. You gave him the truth. I only insisted he sit still long enough to hear it. Lillian adjusted her hat against the glare. Though I confess I did enjoy watching his daughter put that shotgun down before he had the chance to do something regrettable with it. Elijah laughed, a real laugh this time, unguarded, and the sound of it did something warm and unfamiliar to Lillian's chest that she chose, for the moment, not to examine. The trouble found them on the 3rd day, in a narrow defile where the trail climbed steep between red rock walls, and it found them without warning beyond the crack of a rifle shot that sent stone chips singing off the boulder 6 inches from Lillian's head. Down, Elijah shouted, already hauling his horse's head around and reaching across the gap between them to drag Lillian from her saddle into the cover of a fallen boulder as a second shot cracked out, closer this time. Hendricks, Elijah spat, peering around the edge of the rock at 2 riders picking their way down the slope above them, rifles glinting in the sun. He must have guessed we'd come this way, or he's been watching the Weller ranch. How many? 2 that I can see. Lillian's heart hammered, but her hands, when she reached into her doctor's bag, were steady from long habit, closing around the small revolver she carried on her rounds through country where wolves and worse sometimes crossed a lone rider's path. I am not entirely without teeth, Elijah. He glanced at the little pistol, and something like startled respect crossed his face before another shot forced them both lower. Can you use that? I have put down a rabid dog with it and once discouraged a drunk man from an examination room. I would rather not test it further, but yes. Then keep low, and if they come around that eastern boulder, you put a shot near enough to make them think twice. I'm going to work around behind them through that gully. Elijah, your shoulder will hurt considerably less than a bullet through it, he said, already moving, low and quick despite the wound, and I would rather take that risk than sit here and let them pick us off at their leisure. He was gone before she could argue further, moving in a low crouch along the base of the rock wall, and Lillian pressed herself against the boulder with her small pistol gripped in both hands, heart pounding, counting the seconds. Another shot rang out, and a man's voice, rough and impatient, called down, "Come on out, Reed, and bring the lady doctor with you nice and slow, and maybe we let her ride home after." Lillian did not answer. She watched the eastern boulder Elijah had indicated, and when a shadow moved around it, rifle first, she did exactly as he'd instructed, firing a shot that kicked dust an arm's length from the man's boots. He swore and ducked back, and in the confusion that followed she heard a sharp cry, a scuffle, and then Elijah's voice, breathless but triumphant. "Clear. Come out, it is clear. She came around the boulder to find Elijah standing over one man, disarmed and sitting hard against the rock with his hands raised, while the second, presumably the one she'd startled, was nowhere in sight save the sound of a horse crashing away downslope in retreat. "Hendricks," Elijah said, nodding at the man on the ground, whose face was pale and furious. "Corbett's man. He will not tell us much, but he has already told us plenty just by being here, 6 miles from Miller's Pass, on the same trail Pratt would have used." Lillian knelt, professional habit overriding the adrenaline still coursing through her, and checked the man for injury with brisk efficiency despite his glare. "You are not hurt beyond a bruise, it seems. Small mercy for you." She looked up at Elijah. "What do we do with him?" "We take his horse, his rifle, and his boots, and leave him a canteen and enough sense to walk back the way he came," Elijah said. "It will slow him considerably, and slow word getting back to Corbett that we are close." It was not gentle, but it was not cruel either, and Lillian found herself agreeing with the calculation, even as some part of her catalogued, with quiet approval, that Elijah Reed was a man who chose the harder mercy over the easier violence when he had the choice available to him. They pressed on, wary now, aware that time had grown shorter still, and it was that evening making camp in a stand of aspen with the mountain air finally beginning to carry a whisper of coolness that the valley below had forgotten existed, that Elijah, tending the small fire with his good arm, said quietly, "You did not hesitate back there, firing that shot." "I have hesitated plenty of times in my life, Elijah, simply not usually with a rifle pointed at me." She managed a tired smile. "Fear has a way of clarifying what needs doing. I have known men who freeze the first time real danger finds them, men who talk brave until the moment it matters." He looked at her across the firelight, something warm and unguarded in his expression that had not been there before. "You are not one of them. Neither, it seems, are you," she said, "though I would prefer you did not make a habit of leaping toward gunfire with a shoulder wound not yet 3 weeks healed. I will take that under advisement, doctor." His mouth curved, and for a moment, sitting in the mountain dusk with danger only just past and more waiting ahead, something easy and warm passed between them that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the particular, fragile trust of two people who had chosen, in a hard moment, to protect each other. They reached the tree line below Miller's Pass on the 4th day, and it was there, as they climbed higher into thinner air, that the weather turned against them with a suddenness that unnerved even Elijah, who had spent years reading mountain skies. "This early," he said, frowning up at clouds that had gathered with startling speed over the peaks ahead, gray and heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the drought-cracked valley they'd left behind. "September snow in the high country is not unheard of, but this is early even for that. How much time do you think we have?" "Not much. We need to find that shack before dark, or we will be finding it in a blizzard instead." They pushed the horses as hard as the terrain allowed, following Mary Weller's careful map up a narrowing deer trail as the light began to fail, and the first flakes of snow, incongruous and strange after weeks of blistering heat, began to sift down through the pines. By the time they found the old trapper's shack, tucked into a fold of rock with its door hanging open on one hinge, the wind had picked up into a howl, and visibility had dropped to a few dozen feet of swirling white. The shack was empty, and worse, it had clearly been searched, its meager furnishings overturned, a strongbox forced open and emptied, papers scattered and half-burned in the cold hearth. "Hendricks' men found this place before we did," Elijah said grimly, crouching to sift through the charred remains of what had clearly been ledger pages, most illegible now, curling black at the edges. "Pratt must have gotten out ahead of them." Lillian knelt beside him, examining what remained. Perhaps a third of the pages had survived, smoke-damaged but legible enough, she thought, to corroborate the story, but perhaps not enough alone to convict a man as careful as Silas Corbett. Where would he go? Elijah stood, moving to the shack's small window, peering out into the whiteout with an expression she recognized now as the particular stillness he wore when working through a hard problem. "There is a cave higher up that trappers used before this shack was ever built. If Pratt knew the country at all, or if he was desperate enough to keep climbing rather than be caught here, he might have gone there. In this," Lillian gestured at the swirling snow beyond the window, already thick enough to obscure the tree line they'd ridden through not 20 minutes before. "If he is up there hurt in this weather without shelter, he will not survive the night." Elijah turned to her, and she saw the decision already made in his eyes before he spoke it. "I have to try. Then we go together. Lillian, this is not the same as riding a trail with visibility. This is a man losing his way 6 feet from his own door in weather like this. Which is precisely why you need someone beside you who can treat him the moment you find him, because from what you describe, he will need it badly," Lillian said, already gathering her bag, her voice brooking no argument. "You know this mountain better than I do. I know how to keep a dying man alive once we reach him. Neither skill is worth much without the other today, Elijah. We go together, or you do not go at all, because I promise you I will follow regardless." He looked at her for a long moment, snow already beginning to gather in his dark hair from the door he'd left cracked, and something in his face broke open into an expression of such raw respect, and something warmer besides that Lillian felt it land in her chest like a physical touch. "All right," he said quietly. "Together." They tied a length of rope between them before they left the shelter of the shack, a precaution Elijah insisted on with a grimness that told Lillian exactly how dangerous he judged the crossing to be, and stepped out into a world that had, in the space of an hour, transformed from summer drought into something closer to the heart of winter. The wind tore at them, driving snow horizontal, and within minutes Lillian had lost all sense of direction beyond the taut line of rope connecting her to the man ahead, his shoulders hunched against the storm, moving with the sure, careful steps of someone reading a landscape by memory and instinct, because sight had become nearly useless. "How much farther?" she called, her voice torn away by the wind almost before the words left her mouth. "Not far," Elijah called back, though she could not tell if he believed it or simply needed her to. The climb grew steeper, the footing treacherous with snow already accumulating over loose scree, and twice Lillian felt her boots slide out from under her, caught only by the rope's sudden, jerking tension as Elijah, sensing the fall through the line between them, braced and held. Once he stumbled himself, going down hard on one knee with a sound of pain that made her heart seize, but he was up again before she could reach him, waving her back with a sharp gesture that said, more clearly than words, "Keep moving, we cannot stop." They found the cave more by accident than design, Elijah nearly walking past the narrow black opening in the rock face before some instinct made him pause, turn, peer closer through the whirling snow. "Here," he shouted, and Lillian scrambled to his side, and together they ducked into a darkness that was, blessedly, still and silent after the shrieking wind outside. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust, and in that moment Lillian heard it before she saw it. A rasping, uneven breath from somewhere in the cave's deeper shadow, and Elijah was already moving, striking a match with hands that shook from cold, and the small flare of light showed them a man curled against the rock wall, one leg dark with dried blood, his face gray and slack, lips faintly tinged blue. "Pratt," Elijah said, kneeling beside him. "Jonas Pratt, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered, unfocused, and Lillian was already beside him, fingers at his throat, finding a pulse thin and fast and dangerously weak, his skin cold to a degree that told her exposure had already done grievous work alongside whatever wound marked his leg. "He is severely hypothermic," she said, her voice clipped and professional even as her hands moved with practiced speed, unwrapping the crude, blood-soaked bandage someone, Pratt himself perhaps, had tied around a gunshot wound in his calf. "And this wound is infected. Elijah, I need a fire now and every blanket we carried." There was no wood in the cave, But Elijah, without hesitation, went back out into the storm and returned minutes later with an armload of dead branches broken from a stunted pine that clung to the rock near the entrance, snow-caked and shaking with cold himself. And between them they built a small fire that filled the cave with smoke, but also, gradually, with heat. Lillian worked through the night, cleaning and redressing Pratt's wound by firelight, forcing sips of whiskey-laced water past his cracked lips, wrapping him in every blanket they had, while Elijah held the man against his own body for warmth, sharing heat the only way the mountain allowed. Pratt drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragments, Corbett's name, an apology to someone unnamed, and once with startling clarity, the papers, in my boot. I kept the important ones in my boot. Elijah found them there near dawn, when the storm had finally begun to slacken outside the cave mouth. A folded set of pages, damp but intact, in Jonas Pratt's own cramped handwriting, detailing payments to Hendricks and Cole for work described only as Valley Operations, dated and signed, alongside a letter, unfinished, addressed to a territorial judge, in which Pratt had begun, haltingly, to confess everything he had been asked to hide. "This is enough," Elijah breathed, reading by firelight, his voice rough with something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of hope he had not let himself feel in weeks. "Lillian, this is enough to hang the whole scheme around Corbett's neck. Then let us make certain the man who carries it lives to say so himself," Lillian said, not looking up from where she knelt over Pratt, checking the wound dressing, feeling for the fever that had not yet broken but had not, mercifully, worsened either. They spent 2 more days in that cave, storm-bound, the blizzard raging outside with a fury that made any attempt at travel a death sentence. And it was in those 2 days, tending Pratt together through the worst of his fever, sharing what little food they had, that something between Lillian and Elijah shifted from partnership into something neither of them had words ready for yet. On the second night, with Pratt finally sleeping peacefully for the first time, his fever broken, his breathing steady, Lillian sat close to the fire beside Elijah, both of them exhausted in the particular, hollowed way that came after fear had finally released its grip, and found herself simply looking at him, at the strong, tired lines of his face, the careful, gentle way his hands had held a stranger's suffering body through the worst of the night, and felt something settle in her chest that she had been holding at arm's length since the moment she'd knelt over him bleeding in the dust of Larkspur's Main Street. "You have not once," she said quietly, "tried to tell me what I should or should not be doing on this mountain, not once told me it was no place for a woman or that I ought to leave the harder decisions to you." Elijah turned to look at her, firelight flickering warm across his features. "Would it have done any good if I had?" "No," Lillian admitted, and something like a laugh, soft and surprised, escaped her. "No, it would not have. Then I saw little point in wasting breath on it. Besides," and here his voice dropped, low and honest, "I have watched you work these past 2 weeks, Lillian, and I do not know a man or woman living who could have done what you have done, out here, with what little we carried. I would be a fool to think there was anything you needed my permission for." The use of her given name, unadorned, sent something warm curling through her chest, and before she could think better of it, before caution or propriety or the long habit of guarding herself could intervene, Lillian leaned forward across the small distance between them and kissed him. It was not a long kiss, nor a bold one in its execution, gentle and searching and a little uncertain at its start, but it was, unmistakably, her choice, made with open eyes and a steady heart, and when she drew back, searching his face for whatever answer might be written there, she found Elijah looking at her with an expression of such stunned, unguarded warmth that any doubt she might have carried dissolved entirely. "Lillian," he said, her name like something precious in his mouth, and then he closed the distance again himself, his hand coming up gentle against her jaw, and the second kiss was neither uncertain nor brief, warm and sure, and full of everything 2 exhausted, frightened, hopeful people had been carrying unspoken across 4 hard days of mountain trail. When they finally parted, breathless, the fire crackling low beside them and the storm outside beginning, at last, to quiet. Elijah rested his forehead against hers and said, low and rough, I have been trying not to want this since the moment you told Hiram Weller his own daughter had more sense than he did. Lillian laughed, soft and real, against his mouth. I have been trying not to want it since roughly the moment you woke up, and thank me for saving your life instead of arguing about whether a woman ought to have been the one to do it. I would be a poor sort of man to argue with the person who dug a bullet out of my ribs. You would be surprised how many have tried. He kissed her again, softer this time, and outside the cave, the last of the blizzard's fury spent itself against the mountain, leaving behind a hush of new-fallen snow and a sky. When Lillian finally looked out past his shoulder, beginning to clear toward morning. They brought Jonas Pratt down off the mountain 2 days later, once he was strong enough to sit a horse with Elijah riding close beside to steady him. The journey slow and careful but blessedly uneventful, the early storm having apparently driven Hendricks and whatever remained of Corbett's men to lower ground themselves. They reached the Weller Ranch on the 6th day since leaving Larkspur, 1 day before the note on Hiram Weller's ranch was due, to find Mary Weller had done her work well. Patrick Doyle himself was there, arms crossed, standing beside Hiram Weller on the porch in the particular stiff posture of 2 proud men not yet ready to admit how glad they were of an excuse to stop being enemies. You have proof, Doyle said, when Elijah had finished explaining, his voice gruff but no longer hostile. Real proof, not just a fugitive's word. Ledger pages in Corbett's own bookkeeper's hand, and the bookkeeper himself, alive to swear to it, Elijah said, nodding toward Pratt, pale but conscious, sitting wrapped in blankets on the porch steps. It was never a feud between your families, Patrick. It was a man in Chicago deciding your friendship was less valuable than your land. Doyle's jaw worked, old anger and fresh understanding warring visibly on his weathered face, and finally he crossed to Hiram Weller and extended a hand, rough and calloused. I am sorry for the things I thought these past weeks, Hiram. Sorrier still for the things I said. Weller took the hand, gripping it hard. We were both made fools of, Patrick. No shame in a man being fooled by someone working that hard at the deception. The shame would be in staying fooled, now that we know better. It was not, Lillian thought, watching from beside Elijah, a complete reconciliation, not yet. Old grudges did not dissolve in a single handshake, but it was a beginning, and beginnings, in her experience, were worth a great deal. They rode into Larkspur 2 days after that, Pratt still weak but improving daily under Lillian's care, the recovered ledger pages carefully preserved, and found the town holding its breath under the same oppressive heat they had left, the toll-keeper still at the well, Cole still lodging above the saloon with the easy confidence of a man who believed his scheme unassailable. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Sheriff Tom Barlow, reading through Pratt's papers with his hands visibly shaking, to send urgent word by fast rider to intercept Marshal Grant Ashford, whose circuit, by fortunate timing, had already brought him within 2 days' ride for an unrelated matter in the county seat. The marshal arrived 4 days later, a lean, sun-weathered man with tired eyes and no patience whatsoever for what Jonas Pratt's testimony, corroborated by the surviving ledger pages, Tom Barlow's signed account, and Elijah's own detailed statement, revealed to him about Silas Corbett's operations in the Sweetgrass Valley. Corbett himself, when confronted in the very saloon room he had used as his command post for a month, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his scheme, drawing a pistol on the marshal with the wild look of a man who understood, too late, that his careful plans had entirely unraveled. It was Elijah who moved first, knocking the pistol wide with his good arm as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling, and Sheriff Barlow, finding at last the courage that a month of intimidation had buried, who put Corbett in irons before the man could gather himself for a second attempt at anything at all. Cole and the returned, Sullen Hendricks were arrested alongside him within the hour, and by that evening, the toll-keeper had vanished from the town well, and water flowed free again for the first time in weeks, and something in Larkspur's collective shoulders, Lillian thought, watching families gather at the well simply to feel the ordinary miracle of drawing water without fee or fear, seemed to loosen for the first time in a month. The heat wave broke 3 days later, in a thunderstorm that rolled down off the same mountains that had nearly claimed Jonas Pratt's life, filling the parched creek bed with the first real rain the valley had seen since June, and Lillian stood on her own porch watching it fall, Elijah beside her, both of them soaked through within minutes and neither much minding. "You could go anywhere now," Elijah said quietly, watching the rain hammer down on Larkspur's dusty streets, turning them to mud, turning the whole exhausted valley green and hopeful again. "Marshal Ashford will remember your name kindly after this." A doctor who helped uncover a scheme like Corbett's could write her own position in any town in the territory. Lillian turned to look at him, rain dripping from her hat brim, and felt something in her chest settle with a certainty she had not expected to feel so completely so soon, but did not doubt for a moment all the same. "I do not want any town in the territory," she said. "I want this one. I have wanted it for longer than I let myself admit, if I am honest, but I am considerably more certain of it now." "Because of the town?" Elijah asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected and hoped for a different answer. "Because of the town," Lillian agreed, "and because of the man standing in the rain with me who nearly died convincing me it was worth saving." He kissed her then, right there on her own porch in full view of anyone who cared to look, rain running down both their faces, and Lillian Aldridge, who had spent 6 years believing that a woman who insisted on her own profession must therefore give up any hope of a home to match it, found herself, at last, joyfully wrong. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had experienced before, not quite courtship in the formal sense, since they had already weathered together the sort of trial most courting couples never faced, but something steadier and more deliberate, built on the foundation the mountain had already laid. Elijah took work at the Weller Ranch, which Hiram offered readily, grateful and still a little sheepish about the shotgun that had greeted their first meeting, and within a month had saved enough, combined with a small parcel of land Patrick Doyle offered at a fair price as a gesture of the new goodwill between the two families, to begin building a modest homestead of his own at the edge of the valley, close enough to Larkspur that Lillian's clinic remained an easy ride away. Jonas Pratt, fully recovered and grateful beyond measure, testified fully at Silas Corbett's trial in the county seat that autumn, and Corbett was sentenced to a term in the territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy, while Cole and Hendricks, having cooperated in exchange for lighter sentences, disappeared from the valley's memory as quickly as they had arrived in it. The Continental Range and Cattle Company, facing scrutiny it had never anticipated, quietly withdrew its interests from the Sweetgrass Valley entirely, and the Railroad Survey, when it finally came through the following spring, found a valley of neighbors working together rather than a valley of desperate men selling cheap to whoever offered first. Lillian stayed in Larkspur, as she had promised herself in the rain that day, her clinic busier than ever as the town, freed from Corbett's shadow, began at last to grow rather than merely survive, and she found, to her quiet delight, that the town had grown fond enough of her in return that no one so much as raised an eyebrow when Elijah Reed began appearing at her door most evenings, sometimes simply to walk with her, sometimes to sit on her porch while she finished her ledger of the day's patients, sometimes, as autumn deepened, to simply hold her hand in comfortable silence while the valley cooled toward the first frost. They married in October, in a small ceremony at the Larkspur Church, attended by nearly the whole town, Mary Weller standing beside Lillian as her only attendant, Tom Barlow, looking prouder than he had any right to given how little he'd actually done to arrange it, giving Lillian away since her own family remained back in Ohio, and had never quite forgiven her for choosing medicine over marriage the first time around. Patrick Doyle and Hiram Weller sat together at the reception afterward, sharing a bottle of whiskey and a friendship that had, against every odd, grown stronger for having survived the attempt to destroy it. And Jonas Pratt, who had taken up honest work as a clerk for the very county court that had once seemed his only hope of justice, raised a toast to the couple that made Lillian laugh until she cried. "To Dr. Lillian Aldridge," Pratt said, lifting his glass, "who saved a dying stranger and in the process saved an entire valley besides, and to Elijah Reed, who had the good sense to fall in love with the woman brave enough to do it." Lillian, standing beside her husband in the golden light of an autumn evening, the sweetgrass valley spread green and healing around them after a summer that had nearly broken it, felt Elijah's hand find hers, warm and sure, and thought that she had never, in 6 years of restless traveling from town to town, found anywhere in the world she wanted to stay quite so completely as she wanted to stay here, in this valley, with this man, building a home neither of them had known, until the other arrived. That they had been searching for all along. They did not build a large house, nor an especially grand one, but it was theirs, situated on Elijah's modest parcel with a clear view of the mountains that had nearly claimed both their lives and had instead, in the strange logic of hard country, given them to each other. Lillian kept her clinic in town, riding out most mornings on a steady mare Elijah had gentled for her himself, and returned most evenings to a home with a fire already lit and supper already started, not because Elijah expected it of her, but because he had learned, in the way of a man genuinely partnered rather than merely married, that some evenings she came home too exhausted to do anything but eat and sleep, and other evenings she came home eager to talk through every detail of her day. And he had made it his quiet business to be ready for either. Winter came properly that year, the first true winter after the blizzard that had nearly cost them everything and given them everything besides, and on the evenings when snow fell soft and ordinary outside their windows, nothing like the killing fury of that mountain storm, Lillian would sometimes catch Elijah watching the snow with a small, private smile, and knew he was remembering, as she was, the cave and the fire and the moment she had first kissed him. Certain of herself, in a way, she had never quite managed to be certain of anything before. "Any regrets?" she asked him once, curled against his side by their own hearth, the valley outside hushed and white and peaceful, about a stranger riding half dead into a town that changed your whole life. Elijah pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his arms warm and solid around her. "Only that it took a bullet to get me there. I would have found my way to you eventually, Lillian Aldridge. I am simply grateful I did not have to wait longer than I did." Outside, the snow kept falling, gentle and unthreatening, over a valley that had weathered drought and greed and near disaster, and come through the other side changed, as Lillian had been changed, into something stronger and more truly itself than it had been before. She thought of the town she had nearly lost faith in finding, of the man she had saved and who had, in turn, saved something in her she had not known was missing, and she understood, with the same clear certainty that had guided her hands through every difficult surgery of her career, that she had found at last exactly where she was meant to be.